here's something I've noticed. People really, really love Marvel. Now, I don't know if I'm talking so much about the comic books, but the brand of Marvel is a beloved brand. Don't go by what you see on Twitter, okay? Just think about it. Marvel Comics outsell DC Comics thrashingly every month. There's almost nothing that DC can seem to do about it. Now, of course, we know that Absolute is on the horizon as we record this, and things could change. But if history is any indicator, it will be but a blip on the radar of normalcy, which is Marvel dominance. Film wise, please, we don't even need to get into that. The, the MCU is the most dominant film franchise of all time. And yet, if we make a video that is about DC, it tends to do quite a bit better than a video about Marvel. So, why is it that people love Marvel so much more than DC? And yet, so many people online are DCs.
Ooh, I really had to stop myself from DC joke. So I think the way I view this is that Marvel is just so big, so huge. The movies are so big. There are a lot more Marvel fans, but I think the DC fans are a little more vocal, a little more passionate, somewhat in terms of sheer numbers, uh, because maybe they haven't had the best track record of non-comics media for their characters. They've had to, I don't know, fight for it a little more. they've had to go through abusive relationships. Look at all the Snyder Cut fans out there. There's the hashtag. There's our SEO. But I just, I think that they want things to be better, so they're a little more vocal. So that's why we see them more. If that makes sense. Marvel is like, oh, it's good. They're my uncle's uncle probably have watched the Marvel movie. So it's just more understood. Where DC is still a bit of a quantity that's a little up in the air outside of like Batman. Even like Superman's a question mark for some people.
Yeah, I think that volume point makes a lot of sense. Being able to get a lot of be able to see a lot of what you have on the page and get it translated into other forms of medium or other media is probably going to be the biggest incentive to people wanting to talk around and talk about things. But whether or not that builds back into comics, I think is separate. Yeah, I feel like there's more of a negativity around the publication of the books and the creators associated and the way that things have transitioned away from what is people's perception of good. And on the DC front, yeah, you don't get as many blockbuster hits. They sell, well, frankly, they do pretty well, but from a sales standpoint, but you find ways to bash on things like The Flash, on Batfleck. There's a lot more built-in negativity to the movie franchises that translates into wanting positivity for the DC comic side. I swear DC comics are good. Promise me, don't Aquaman. That's the movie. The comics are where it's at, and you have to defend and fight for that.
What Aquaman comic? There is none right now.
Well,
There wasn't one when the movie came out.
well,
I also think there's, when you go back even further, you have things like the Super Friends, which are traditionally more kiddie, more childish, less mature than any given Marvel story almost. Because even if you think back to like Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends, you still were dealing with Peter Parker at his job, getting yelled at by J. Jonah Jameson. Like that's still kind, set like semi-mature in a superhero story. Versus Superman and Batman are best friends. They're gonna go beat up the bad guys.
would you say that makes Marvel more accessible because it's more realistic, quote unquote? It's the world outside your window. It's what Stanley has always,
Yes.
talked about.
Yeah. Yeah.
That more people can like it because they can see themselves in it more.
Well, and it lasts has a longer tail than, Bam Biff Pow. Oh, cool, Batman was on.
I don't know, man. I'm sort of struggling with this conversation because it took a long time for Marvel to really get its feet on the ground in mass media with movies and things like that. Prior to Blade, right? We really only had what the Hulk had a TV show that obviously was popular, people like that. But really, Marvel stuff was more relegated to animated series and little things like that. There wasn't any big hitter unless I'm mistaken. Whereas in the DC side of things, you had the Batman 66, which was enormous. You had the Superman the movie, which of course it was what it was, which was huge. Batman 89 was massive.
Wonder Woman.
Sorry?
Wonder Woman TV show.
Wonder Woman TV show was huge. The DC characters had a foothold in America first in terms of being what people recognized. And then when you get into the 90s, you're still talking about Batman the Animated Series, which owned the 90s from a superhero media standpoint. And all throughout those years, we're getting Batman movies, which, two of them were bad. And I actually think had a huge negative effect on DC, but they were still there. It took until 2000 to get 2001 to get a Spider-Man movie.
And I think you're right in that they were huge then. But I think the pendulum shifted towards Marvel when Marvel decided to make changes, and they shifted at a time where information was easier to access and that media was easier to access.
But that's only half my point, because the other half of my point is that in the comics, Marvel's been dominant since the 70s. There's never been a time in the early 1970s, DC was already having all hands on deck meetings to figure out why they couldn't outsell Marvel. They've never been able to beat Marvel. It's insane. So what is it about what Marvel does that people just love so much more than DC, that as soon as Marvel existed, DC couldn't compete?
How can they? They use the color red.
There you go.
Is it that world outside your window thing? Is it the fact that it was people first instead of these god archetypes first?
But even before they were god archetypes, like to that point, can't be Batman, right? Like that existed. Superman, sure, he had his superpowers, and that's fantastical in the same way that I think Spider-Man is somewhat fantastical.
Is there a cool factor then?
But what was Batman first? He was Batman. Bruce Wayne kind of trickled along later, and we got deeper story along the way, but he was Batman first.
Well, I don't even think Batman should be in this conversation, because Batman is objectively the most popular superhero on Earth.
Yeah.
So he's got it. Why is it that no one cares about anybody else?
I wonder if it's because Marvel was forced to make people care about a wide variety of characters. Because they kept selling their rights to their characters to other people. Spider-Man went here, Hulk went here. It was a wider net was made.
You're talking about movies?
In media in general, like even when Marvel was doing bad, before the 90s, when actually Stan Lee was kind of selling off the rights to them. Like Spider-Man had a CD and a stage show. I wonder if because everything was everywhere for Marvel, whereas DC kind of got to focus on Batman. They got to focus on Superman. They tried focusing on Wonder Woman with TV and stuff. There was a more core there. And that's why Batman's huge. And I would say we can agree that Batman's probably the biggest one of anything we're talking about here. But Marvel as a brand is bigger.
Marvel as a brand wasn't bigger then though. The I'm saying like the comics were outselling DC hand over fist, but DC was the dominant brand in terms of public recognition. That has changed now, but that was true up until the 2000s.
Was DC more popular, or was Superman and Batman more popular? You know what I mean? Like, did people back then know it as DC? Is my question, because there's always like the regulars or the normies. I hate to say it. They think Batman's Marvel or Spider-Man's DC. Like the idea of that doesn't really exist.
I don't know. It feels like we're getting into a semantics thing. I'm just saying that DC characters were mega popular.
It's yeah, I mean, it's the characters of DC are the massive archetypes. When you think of these characters, you think of, a symbol and one particular thing. Whereas with people like Spider-Man and the X-Men, you're thinking about the people behind it. They're more characters than symbols. And that's, that's been the difference from day one. And I think that's the thing that makes it popular.
I have a hot one to throw out. I don't even know if it's that hot, but the Marvel characters are literally newer. They were made later. They were made with more of the sensibilities of modern, even though we're going back, 60 years, modern people with modern problems
Modern
and
storytelling.
modern storytelling. Yes, I think that is a major reason why. If Superman were created today from absolute scratch, which it's hard to conceptualize because that's not happening, he would be very different. He would be presented in a different way than when he was created and presented at that time. And that would have been true if he were introduced in 1967.
Yeah.
To that point, he would be a small town boy living in a big city, just got his first gig. Also, he's Superman. Versus he is Superman, and he is also this kid from a rural town. He's moved to the big city, all that kind of stuff. The iconography exceeds the person.
I imagine
I
if
can see that.
I imagine if DC at its inception had a young, hungry group of people like Marvel's bullpen did when Marvel was created, we might not be even having this discussion. I just think there was a lot of young energy at the time of the creation of Marvel that made their comics something that people wanted to read.
A lot of them were also created at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I was about to say is so much of DC's stable, was created in the 20s and 30s, and they were sold around, eventually into what became DC.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I'm always so amazed by how popular Marvel is. Even now, when I personally think that, DC's comics are arguably better at the current moment in time. And I see that opinion a lot. And I'm a Marvel guy. I am a Marvel guy, 100%. But I think if we're just looking at quality, I feel like the DC books are better. And yet, if you strictly go by numbers, that's not what you're going to find. And it really never has been. And I just think that's so wild.
Right now, you're going to find that Thundercats is more popular than DC.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
Transformers.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It really is. And I know that we've got a DC leaning audience. And I think that is so funny for a variety of reasons, but most of which is, where are the Marvel people at? Where are you guys at? You're there, you're buying the books, you're watching the movies, you're watching the shows, you're everywhere. But where are you at?
They're in Fortnite, Sean. There's a whole Marvel event going on in there.
Ah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let us know where you're at with this subject in the comments. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe, like the video if you liked it. Until next time, take care, guys.